The bushfire situation is still a very real one in New South Wales. Earlier I spoke to Nationals MP Barnaby Joyce, getting first of all his thoughts and exactly what's going on in his electorate, but also more broadly about what needs to happen in the future and indeed if Australia was properly prepared for this season. Barnaby Joyce, thanks for your time. Still an active fire situation around New England. What can you tell us about the situation on the ground? How bad is it?
Okay, well, for instance, the Ebor fire is so intense that it's creating its own weather system, its own cloud system above it. Well, that's what I saw the other day. It started after someone started backburning around their dope crop, which is very unfortunate. He's been very successful in his backburning, burned out tens of thousands of hectares. The Moonbee fire, which is at the back of my parents' place, and I was actually fighting it myself with my neighbours. It seems to be under control. The place is completely and utterly covered in heavy smoke. Other fires went up to Torrington yesterday. Around about 10 or so houses, 14 houses and outbuildings burnt down. Spoke to the people of Torrington, trying to make sure that we do whatever we can. See, Waitalabar, that's also a disaster and loss of life there. The trouble is, a lot of the places that have been burnt are the people who are doing it tough already. And this just exacerbated their situation. And down near Yarrawitch, massive fire there as it came out of the forest that goes down to the coast. So yeah, it looks hellish, and whilst the drought is on. So what do you do? Yeah,
well, as you said, people are going through hell already. It's only November. Do you think Australia was fully prepared for this bushfire season?
I think there's a lot of knowledge to be taken from this bushfire season. And I think there's a range of issues that need to be changed. One is fundamental things such as access to places so that we can get people out and get fire trucks in, moving the trees back from the roads, making sure that the excessiveness of tree clearing guidelines are ameliorated in such a way that you get proper access, and also to get fire trails back up and running so that they were just let go. Formerly, to be quite frank, under state Labor government, we need to change that round and make them accessible. Central watering points. A lot of the dams in state forests and national parks were what they call decommissioned, that is filled in. And of course, when you go, fires have to be fought with water. And they should have the capacity for earthen storages, earthen dams in state forests, in national parks, to get access to water. And I believe a grant system to people on the land and say, look, we'll build you a big dam, stock can use it, but when a fire starts, it's our dam and our water. And I think that would also help. And strategic and more proficient backburning and fuel reduction loads. I know some are saying, oh, well, you can't find the window to do it, but I think this is important.
Yeah.
A fire burns fuel, and if you reduce the fuel, the fire's not going to burn with the same intensity.
So there's been a lot of talk on hazard reduction. I know last week you mentioned it was in part to blame, you were blaming councils on a lack of ability to do backburning. What's your evidence of that? What councils and in what way were they doing that?
Councils is the people who work with the forest, and they won't go on the record, obviously, it's their jobs, but you're talking to people from the National Parks and Wildlife Services who've been around it and say, look, the bureaucracy that's now involved in trying to get greater strategic backburns is excessive. So I don't make it up myself, I take it on what they are saying, and also to the people around areas that have been burnt out, and they quite openly say, we needed more strategic backburning. We didn't get it, and of course there was a fuel load there and burnt the place out.
Because the RFS, when we were speaking to them last week, was saying that the issue they've had with this particular season of backburning, or hazard reduction to put it more accurately, ahead of the fire season, was the window just wasn't big enough and they weren't being thwarted by rules or bureaucracy. It was just the season. Do you accept that?
Well, I accept that the RFS obviously is an arm of government, is a vessel of government. They have to work within the edicts of government. So even if they thought differently, they would be very remiss of them and unwise to express those views publicly. So I'm taking views from third parties that are not the RFS and not the government. Now, I don't...
So you think people even within the RFS are afraid to speak out, essentially?
I think that people who are not in the RFS are speaking out, and they're speaking out to me and making their views quite clear about it. That's what I think.
What are you talking about? Is this a council block? Is it the state government's policy? What is it exactly?
I think it's state government policy. I think there's excessive regulation. in being able to get strategic backburns. And I'll give you an example of one person who I was fighting a fire with the other day. He said you should pay people on a per hectare basis rather than, a strategic burn here. And of course, once a fire starts, the only way you're really going to stop it in a lot of areas is to create a buffer area. And the best way to create a buffer area, of course, is with an alternate fire that burns back to the main fire front. I do have some knowledge of this because I've been doing it myself, and I've lived in an area where we've got bushfires and always have had bushfires. And so, how do you reduce bushfires? You reduce fuel loads. And obviously, you make sure that people don't start fires. That's always a very good start.
So yeah, well, that's obviously a big one too, and a lot of, amazingly, still a lot of arsonists out there, allegedly, I should say, cases to go. You mentioned a per hectare payment. How would that work? I mean, can you create a perverse incentive there?
Well, I think that there should be a per hectare goal as to how much needs to be burned. There's sort of small strategic burns without a shadow of a doubt, but there needs to be a wider scale. Now, Tom, you're going to ask me, but this is not the view of the RFS. I'm telling you the views of other people who are right next to the fires, who've been burnt out by fires. And I think their views have some validity, seeing they live with the consequences of the fires.
Absolutely. Look, we've had a lot of people write in, for example, and talk about not being able to clear wood and so on from national parks. Now, I don't know what the situation is. I'm not there. But at the same time, the RFS is saying...
In many instances, Tom, they can't even clear wood from their own place. That's one of the ridiculous things.
Right, so the RFS, though, is saying there is a strategic aspect to this. They do have targets, they have areas they want to get to, and they have sizes of backburns they want to do. But again, it's the season that's thwarting them. Well,
there's always the capacity somewhere during winter to have more strategic backburns. And, you can just say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. That's life. We'll just have another fire.
No, nothing.
We'll have another fire like this in 5 years' time. Well, how foolish do we look then? And when you said, well, from these massive fires, you've learnt nothing. Well, we do know what the reasons are. We do have the people who are living right next door to the fires. We must respect their views. They live closer to the fires, to be quite frank, than many in the upper bureaucracies in Sydney live next to them. Their views do have validity. They should be respected in their views and listened to. And, we live near the fires. We know it. We work with it. I mean, it's our life. It's our area. We've got a rough idea how we're working. And just by the way, for tens of thousands of years, the Aboriginals had a fair idea of how the countryside worked as well.
Well, there's also a lot of people up close with these fires, including those fighting them, that say they have been getting worse. And the evidence we have is that they will get worse over future years with climate change. Should we factor this into climate change policy, that there is a cost to not acting further on emissions reduction?
Well, I'm not doubting for 1 second that the climate's changing, Tom. What I've always doubted is the capacity of Australia by itself to change it back. And to be quite frank, I'm hugely cynical when people say, well, the way to fix the bushfires is for 76 people out of 151 in Canberra to vote for a piece of legislation, then miraculously we won't have fires anymore, or they'll be reduced.
No, it's not about eliminating them,
that'll
but if
have
you look
no
at future
effect
risk
whatsoever on what happens to fires.
And yes, we have 1.3% of emissions, which is very low, but at the same time, if we take a lower emissions policy, we can try to drive a bigger Paris commitment that would have a bigger impact.
Well, do you think China's going to follow Australia's lead? I mean, that's remarkably heroic. And do you think India's going to say, oh, well...
Australia might be one of a whole bunch of countries that make up, say, a third of the world's emissions?
India will fall in line with Australia's edict from Canberra? I don't think so. I think that they'll make their own decisions.
You don't think Australia has a global advocacy role at all?
I think that you completely overestimate how far that goes, and to believe that legislation in Australia is going to drive the agenda in China. If you can drive the agenda in China, Tom, get them to release the Uyghur people incarcerated in the northwest. Start with that, or maybe stop organ donations or something else. If you believe that Australia is sort of the preeminent moral code in the world, start with those things, see how you go, and if you get anywhere with them, you can start on climate policy.
We'll talk about China in a moment. Can I just ask you about Israel Folau's comments claiming bushfires and drought are a punishment for same-sex marriage and Australia needs to repent? Your reaction?
Well, that's Israel Folau's view. It's not my view. And as I've said before, the way we give this thing ventilation as we all start talking about it, Israel Folau gets a thrill out of throwing rocks at us. We think we're righteous throwing rocks back at them. everybody else writes about who's throwing rocks and it sells papers, and the ferment goes on, and it's none of these things assist the people actually fighting the fire. Doesn't so much as make them a ham sandwich. It just makes everybody else feel very virtuous from different approaches at the comments of one person.
All right, and on to China, which you mentioned earlier. A couple of MPs, or three now, banned from entering the country to conduct a study trip, I suppose you'd call it. What does this point to what China's becoming?
It's New World Order, isn't it? And we've got to be realists in exactly where we live in this world. We have the invidious position as our major trading partner. They are kind of running their own show in the South China Sea, and how they believe in a rules-based order. They're not a liberal democracy. They're basically a totalitarian regime, and becoming more so of late. And what we have, the dilemma we have, is that they push forward, and you saw that in the South China Sea, and you see that in some of their policy. We have a real dilemma on our hands, because if you can't match them, you have to match them by pushing back. And of course that can have real consequences. But of course, for any superpower, if they have a more of a sort of a autocratic approach, they'll say, well, this approach works for us. We just keep pushing forward and pushing forward and pushing forward. I mean, where are you going to draw your line of resistance? How do you deal with that issue? And I don't think sort of jawboning them or talking to them is really going to have much consequence, because as I stated before, if it did, there'd be changes in other aspects, and I suppose the Uyghur people would be a clear example of that.
So where do you sit, though? Do we need to draw a more concrete line soon with China?
Well, I think that my comments on that would be anything but helpful. All I can express is the reality of the world we live in and the situation that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, it's going to be the situation for your children and your grandchildren and all your viewers' grandchildren, because the issues that we have now, if they follow the same trajectory, are going to be vastly worse in the future. And we don't want to get ourselves into a position where, where we have no alternatives, or we become sort of an economic supplicant state. I don't think for one second that China's going to invade us or anything like that. But I think that the economic domination of how we act as a nation could become more and more and more prevalent.
So, I mean, that speaks to, does it not, that there might be a point where we go, look, a decision to speak out or push back on any given policy, we need to make that now. It might hurt us in the short term economically, but this is almost about sovereignty.
To be quite frank, Tom, I've seen it for some time in politics myself, that there's a hesitancy, to be honest, in discussing issues pertinent to China. And I saw that in the past, where many years ago, I tried to bring forward a Senate inquiry dealing with the issues pertinent to China's sort of growth and positioning and what they were doing in the world, and it was rejected because it was seen as could have instigated a sort of some form of retribution or some sort of response. So, unfortunately, and you'll see it in your own discussions, you'll see it everywhere. We've already started sanitising what we say and how we say it, and I think if people are honest, I'd agree with that.
Barnaby Joyce, I could go on. There's a couple of topics I wanted to get to, but we're right out of time. Thanks for your time today.
You're welcome, Tom.